Everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Today's video is going to be somewhat of an overview and first impressions of the KO motor here. This is the RS edition of the motor, and before we get into anything, I want to state that we have zero affiliation with KO. We bought this controller with our own money. It was not sponsored. We waited like everyone else. And I also want to state up front that we are going to do our very best to stay as unbiased as possible. We do sell ASI controllers, and I would say that ASI controllers are direct competition to KO controllers. That being said, we have no competition with the KO motor itself, but we wanted to state up front that, you know, we're going to try our best here. Alright, so as you would expect for a $1,600 motor, it came in some pretty nice packaging here. Got some nice foam, some nice velvet on here, very classy. And here is the motor in comparison to the QS. Now this is a $300 motor, and as I mentioned, this is $1,600. So you expect this to be much nicer in pretty much every way. And the first thing you'll notice is the size difference. The QS, the actual magnet size is pretty considerably smaller than that of the KO. And one thing to note is the QS, despite it being $300, it did come with a pulley pre-installed. And another subject is the wires here. The wires on the QS are quite flexible. And if you didn't know, wires are measured in strand count, which basically the higher the strand count, the more flexible, the more individual copper wires you have. These feel borderline like solid copper wire, which is great for carrying high levels of current. But if you've done any installation work in the motor area of the Sur-Ron, you know that having flexible wires is pretty helpful. So that is not great. I would have liked to actually just have seen higher gauge or lower gauge wires, so thicker wires and a higher strand count, so you have equal current carrying capacity. And getting into the finish here, this came straight out of the box, so we haven't installed it or really done anything with it. And for $1,600, I would really expect like a full Class A finish, meaning basically like no visual defects. And I want to preface this also by saying I actually don't care at all if there are any visual defects, but it is a very expensive motor, so that is what I would expect. So there's obvious nicks in the anodizing, scuffs on it. There's stuff within the actual fins itself that probably would have a pretty hard time finding here. And then right on the very front here, it looks like they use either a very worn out end mill or there was just some junk in it, maybe some stuck aluminum. You can see it's not a super clean finish. There's like some black gunk on the actual finish itself. So just things like that. Again, I do not care at all. It's a far superior finish to the QS, but this is $300. And just to clarify, this is actually $1,300, but after shipping and import tax, it's about $1,600. All right, so we now got all three of the motors here that are directly compatible with the Sur-Ron, QS, stock, and KO. And we're going to look at the connector here for the hall sensor. And right off the bat, the KO is notably the thinnest and has the thinnest gauge wire. And they claim IP69 rating, and that may just be on the motor housing, but I can pretty much guarantee that this connector is not IP69. And if we compare it to the Sur-Ron, for example, you can see just how much thicker the wire gauge is on that versus that. It's probably double. And that could be the shielding, to be fair. But yeah, quite the difference there. And also, as you neck back, much larger piece of heat shrink on it. There's not a lot of movement down in the motor area on the Sur-Ron, so I don't expect this to wear through, but just an observation. And then on the QS, also pretty thick heat shrink as it goes into the motor, but equally thin gauge wire. And I've seen multiple hall sensors fail because of this connector. Well, not the hall sensor itself, but just the connection becoming corroded. And obviously
The connector choice was completely out of KO's control because they were trying to make it plug and play with stock. So can't really fault them for that, but just something we thought we would mention. And the final thing here is the color. And this is not a huge deal to most people, but I am absolutely not a fan of the fact that if you want to buy a motor only, or even if you want to buy a motor and controller combo, you have to get some bright anodized color. This is kind of what I like. And the stock motor, also a nice kind of just earth tone with black. The really bright colors, I think they draw a lot of attention, and I don't dislike the actual color itself or the look, but having non-neutral colors like this make it really hard to match anything on my bike. And the fact that you can only get silver and blue or red and silver if you buy just the motor only, not a big fan of that. I understand that they're trying to sell combo kits, and so they offer better colors if you get that. But again, just pointing out some stuff here. So one issue we had with the QS motor is that the mounting posts here came like considerably wider than they should have been. And I'm not saying that this should have fit directly. Like the actual mount distance here is the same, but that's not to say that QS intentionally made this to fit in the Sur-Ron. So I did have to file down these posts. I did that on the other side. And the stock motor and KO, very impressive tolerance. We're at 5 inches and 5.002. And then over on the KO motor here, got 5.003. So if we're talking about 1,000th of an inch, that basically means nothing. And this should be a direct fit. I'm curious about the width of this. I did have a problem with this one in the bash guard fitting nicely. I will be curious if we run into the same issue here.
So we did check the shaft height here, this ledge to the mounting surface, and there was only a 30 thousandths difference between the KO motor and the stock motor. So that's pretty much negligible as far as like the Sur-Ron tolerances are concerned. One of the biggest difference in general assembly here is that the stock motor has the phase wires on the opposite side of the shaft, and the KO motor has the phase wires coming out of the same side of the motor that the shaft is on. So that is a pretty big difference. We're not sure how that's going to affect the installation, but it is something to note. And the QS motor has the same design as the stock motor. So we are going to measure all of these motors, and we will be doing it with a pulley and bolt included. So first up is the KO.
So 9.75 kilograms, which is about 1/4 kilogram lighter than the listed weight on the website. Although I don't know if the listed weight is with a pulley or not. So without the pulley and nut, we are at 9.5, we'll call it, which is a full 1/2 kilogram or 1 pound lighter than the website claims that it is.
Next, moving on to the stock motor.
With pulley and nut, it is a little more than 2 kilograms lighter, about 2.4 lighter, we'll call it, which is close to 5 pounds. So quite a bit lighter than the KO. And then we'll do the QS motor as well. And the QS already has the nut and pulley installed from the factory, as we discussed. And the QS with pulley is 7.275, which is the lightest of them all. And I would say, notably from our testing, it had the least amount of torque out of all of these. So maybe the weight is indicative of its performance. We will definitely be testing that.
So the next part of this video is just going to be testing against the stock motor, and both of these bikes have BAC 8000s on them, and we're going to keep it at 650 phase amps because it gets like a little bit uncontrollable past that. Yeah, the ground's a little bit wet and we don't want to be spinning the tire or wheeling too much. and we're going to be using 8,000s. I know we only sell 4,000s for now, but considering the purpose of this motor is to be able to handle more power than stock, it seems like we would want to be able to push the limits. So we're going to have a controller that's capable of running the limits of the motor, and then obviously on the stock bike over here it goes pretty far beyond the limits. So the main goal is to test it 60 volts at 12 kilowatts and then at 30 kilowatts, and then we'll also test at 72 volts, 12 kilowatts and 30 kilowatts, and it's just going to be a side-by-side drag race. It's not going to be a top speed test. We have off-road setups and it gets super sketchy above like 55. We are both running 64 tooths. We've also tested on 48 tooths, but considering the kV limit of both motors is so similar, or the kV rating I should say, that the gearing aside, I mean, we'll test on different gearing, but for now it'll just be both have 64 tooths. We're both the same weight, same wheel and tire setup, so it should be pretty fair comparison.
We will be monitoring our speed and just general statistics with the TrailTech GPS, so this will not be a wheel speed sensed top speed. This will be the first run, 60 volt, 12 kilowatts, 650 phase amps, 25% field weakening. We'll do a burnout before we go, and you'll see this going that way at roughly, would you say 100 feet of acceleration?
Like 200?
100 to 200 feet, that's where you'll see us, and you'll see I'm on the stock motor. If I'm ahead, stock motor's doing better, and then Riley's on the KO.
Yeah, I pulled 216 amps, pulled 200, and by the time we both started getting traction, the stock bike was starting to pull away, which may be that like small variation in difference in the kV rating. So we'll also try at 72 volt and some different power levels here, but we may have to turn down the phase amps with how much we're spinning.
First one goes to the stock motor.
Yeah.
All right, 60 volt, run 2.
So after everything you just watched, you probably have some questions about what exactly you saw, and obviously what you saw is not what we explained was going to happen. To give a short backstory, Cole and I have driven an hour, either way to see each other and film this video over the last month, and all 3 times now we've been rained out during testing. And as may have been evident in the video, or is just obvious to you in general, if it's raining or snowing or the ground's even wet, the test is kind of useless. Electric motors generate a lot of torque. The ground's wet, it just slips, and you can't really get accurate testing data. And so by the end of that second clip, it was fairly obvious that it was starting to rain pretty good, and we had to wrap it up. And so just to give a bit of a baseline of what our testing was, we mentioned it in the video earlier, but it was 60 volts, 12 kilowatts, 650 phase amps, which is outside of the higher phase current, what we always run off-road. We usually run 60 volt, 12 kilowatt, 430 phase amp on a back 4000 setup. It's been pretty trusty for us. I would say that, only the super gnarly hill climbs with more torque have been helpful, and even then it was you had a traction issue, or you had enough traction where you were just lifting the front end, and then kind of more torque doesn't really help you out in any way. And so we ran a higher phase current for a couple of reasons. The idea in our head was that we wanted to try and saturate the magnets as much as possible, meaning magnets have a certain point where they cannot handle any more current, and our goal was to see if the KO could take more current without getting saturated in comparison to the stock motor. And based on our obviously very limited testing, we were not able to find a conclusive answer on that. And in general, the testing was highly inconclusive. I certainly would not draw much from what we showed, just because, you know, it was incomplete. The testing situation was not ideal, and moving forward from here, we're still going to perform all of the tests. It's going to have to be in a separate video because this has gotten dragged out way too far. And so what we're going to do from here forward, we purchased a Draggy, which many of you may know is like a super high performance performance meter. A lot of drag racers use it, and that kind of just takes all of the guessing out of it. You set it up, you do your run, and it gives you all your performance metrics like your 60-foot time, your 100-foot, your 300-foot, your eighth mile, quarter mile, how long did it take to get to 30 miles an hour, 60. You can set it up however you want. And the point in doing that would just be that data means more than how you felt, or, you know, even side by side, drag racing has its flaws. And so we want to use that, get as accurate of data as possible, and that kind of leaves fewer questions. That being said, there are still some questions. So back to the testing, we mentioned it was 1 to 200 feet. I actually went back and measured it on Google Maps. It was 336 feet. And so the section you guys could see in the video was like in between the 275 marker and the 330 marker. And the reason for testing over such a short span is Cole and I do not care about the top speed at all. Anyone who follows our channel knows we don't ride on the road. We don't have a road set up. We don't really have an interest in riding on the road. I think that a lot of what the KO appeals to is road riders, but in the same vein, we wanted to test it. And so we want to see, does it generate more torque over a certain distance, yielding a higher acceleration? And based on what you just watched, I think, as inconclusive as it might be, it was not like an absolute landslide where, you know, the KO was just like crushing the stock motor. And in fact, the stock motor was actually pulling away from the KO on every test that we did. We did like 2 runs on camera, and before that we did another 2 runs, and then it started raining, so we couldn't do any more. But consistently in all 4 runs, you know, we had from 0 to 25, we did a rolling start, 0 to 25 feet. And then from 25 to 75 feet or so, both were just spinning the tire. So not any useful data there. But once they both hooked up and we were both full throttle and we were both pulling about 200 amps, yeah, Cole was just pulling away on the stock motor. And, you know, we're the same weight, same gearing, same power, everything was the same. But there's a little bit of nuance to that I want to get into further. And so when you twist the throttle on your bike, you are demanding a certain amount of torque from your motor. And the word torque and phase current here are going to be interchangeable. The two are proportional based on a constant. And so what that kind of looks like is you twist your throttle, you're demanding a certain level of torque, where if you have your phase amp set to 650, say, you go full throttle, you're demanding 650 phase amps, or whatever that converts to in torque. And so what this looks like over a range is, you know, you have your RPM down here, and from 0 to say 2000 RPM, you have a very sharp increase to your peak torque, which will be somewhere over here. You obviously don't want your peak torque at 0 RPM, or else it's going to be entirely unrideable. And then it kind of slowly levels off as you increase, for kind of reasons we won't get into. But my point in showing this is that we actually did not have enough time to set up the PI control so that those 2 plots were the same between the 2 motors. And the purpose of doing that is it wouldn't be fair, for example, if in this graph, the Sur-On motor and the KO motor, if they were tuned in a way in which this graph looked different, because your torque versus your RPM really is what defines your acceleration. And so in our next video on this comparison, we're going to be trying to get these 2 graphs for both motors as equal as possible. And what that'll tell us in a highly nuanced sense is that if both are generating the same current at the same RPM and they both go the same speed, that kind of tells us that the torque constant between the 2 of them is the same. And what that means for us as off-road riders is that we're not going to see a huge torque benefit in using this motor. And I know people are going to say, well, if you gear down you can experience the torque benefits of this, that, and the other. I've ridden both on a 48 tooth setup at the same power and had the same conclusion. They felt the same. And so people get into KV ratings and this, that, and the other. And the KV ratings between the two of these motors, to my understanding, is within 5% of each other. And so, you know, KV shouldn't be a huge factor. And even if it were, if both of these, you know, have a similar torque constant, or even if the KO is supposed to have a higher torque constant because it has a lower KV value, then those first, you know, 100 to 200 feet, it should, you wipe this on the stock motor. There should be notably more torque. In my experience, with the same setup, the torque seemed the same. And so, as I mentioned, there's nuance to that, and just because you're running the same power in the same max phase current, it doesn't mean this plot's going to look the same between the two motors, because at the end of the day, both motors require different PI tuning. And if you've done any of that kind of stuff with these two motors, you know that the values are not the same. And so moving forward, the couple things we need to do are, we need to get a dry day. We need to get the draggy set up so we're not just racing side by side, because that's kind of meaningless. And we also need to test it a lot wider range of power levels, phase current levels, and sprockets. And I think that would be more conclusive. And again, I think at the end of the day, you're comparing a $500 motor to a $1,600 motor. I expect the KO one to be better, but I want it to be notably better in the sense that, you know, there is more torque generation. If the only thing I gain by spending an additional, you know, $1,000 is a better heat handling, maybe better waterproofing, and then a higher rated RPM, which, you know, we don't care about for off-road anyway, to me that's not worth it. As cool as it looks, as big as it is, as much as it can handle high heat, there needs to be a little bit more skin in the game for the price point. And so, yeah, with that being said, we're going to be filming more, and frankly, what we really want to do is test off-road. That's kind of our bread and butter. We need to test the heat handling, and we aren't going to ride wide open down the street back and forth on the setup that we have. It's just dangerous with mud tires. And so off-road is going to be the only way to do that. Oregon winters definitely slow us down there. So as spring comes around, that's when we plan to get the majority of our off-road testing in. And then aside from that, kind of other news, we also have a KO controller that we're going to be testing. The problem is we have to finish testing with this setup, which is the 8000 and the KO motor, and then we'll move over to the KO controller. We'll compare that with the KO motor, with the stock motor, BAC 4000, BAC 8000, everything together. We're going to do testing for it, different voltages, sprockets, whatever. And as I've mentioned in our videos, the only thing we have interest in is just selling the best product. So that's the goal with all these testing videos, is we're going to get to the bottom of what's best with the resources we have, the testing knowledge we have, and yeah, we hope you enjoy the content we put out from that, and hopefully you get some education out of it. So if you appreciate these videos, please like and subscribe to our channel. Helps us out a lot, and have a nice day.